Well, welcome so much to our Mountain of Authors 2021 and our first in-person event in over a year. Yeah. So those of you who are not familiar with our Mountain of Authors, it's a yearly program that the Pikes Library District puts on highlighting local authors. This year, the panel is called A Case File of Conversations, Crime and the People That Chronicle It. Tonight we have 4 amazing panelists who have all worked in the area of true crime, and they have some great stories for us. My name's Taryn Malala, and I'm a librarian here at Pikes Peak Library District, and I'll be tonight's moderator. Let's start with Dwight, and we'll have you introduce yourselves.
Hello, I'm Dwight Havercorn. I used to be a police officer in Colorado Springs. I retired from the city of Colorado Springs in 2003, and I track all the homicides from 1872 to present in the 4th Judicial District, which takes in El Paso and Teller counties, because before 1899, Teller was part of El Paso County. So do all those. There's 10 volumes of 3-ring notebooks at the library of the homicides I've typed up from out of the newspapers. I'm also the president of the El Paso County Pioneers Association and one of the 2 archivists for the Colorado Springs Police Department.
Hi, my name's Olivia Prensel. I'm a reporter for the Gazette, and I cover crime, police, and public safety. I've worked at the Gazette for about 2 years, and Lance and I, we covered a triple homicide from 1985 for our podcast called Colorado Cold Case, and we'll be sharing more about that later on.
Hi, I'm Lance Benzel. I've been a reporter since 2001, and I've been at the Gazette here in Colorado Springs since 2008. I work at the courthouse. I principally cover trials and criminal cases, but I do lots of other things in the area of crime as well, including the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good evening. I'm Donnell Ann Bell. I am a 35-year resident of Colorado Springs, and I have taken 3 Citizens Academy, the Colorado Springs Police Academy, the El Paso County Sheriff's Academy, and a Writers Academy, which took in North Carolina. It's called the Writers Police Academy. In addition to my Citizens Academy, I became a volunteer for the El Paso County Sheriff's Office and did several ride-alongs with police officers and deputies, which I highly recommend. And that led to the publication of 5 books because I finally felt comfortable in writing police procedure and police characters because I didn't know any police officers at that time. The book that I'm here being invited for is called Black Pearl, and if you love Colorado, it takes place in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Montrose, and thank you for having me.
Amazing, thank you. So let's jump right in. Feel free to answer. However, if you guys feel like you don't have an answer to a question, just skip it, you're good. But let's start. Are there any cases that you have worked that have stayed with you or haunted you? Or how did maybe the podcast affect you guys?
I've got one from when I worked in the police department's crime lab in December of 1976. My oldest child was a little over a year and a half old, and they called me to say that there was a victim up in the intensive care at Penrose Hospital. And so I came in the department. They said, before you go, we want you to take pictures of this guy that we've arrested for ID. So I took some ID photos of him. He was stalking character with attitude written all over him. And I left there, went up to Penrose Penrose Hospital up north, and go in ICU, and here's this 14-month-old boy laying in the bed, eyes wide open, non-reactive to anything. And it's not a good sign when you go in and the ICU nurses are crying. So I had to take ID photos of him, and the flash we had for our cameras in those days called a sun gun. And you literally could not react to it. It's the brightest thing you've ever seen. It would light up a 400-foot section of Academy Boulevard at midnight. And I took photos, and he didn't even as much as blink. So by the next morning, he had passed. And they sent us out to the apartment where they thought the boy had been injured. And the guy had admitted that, well, he'd been swinging him around and his head may have banged the floor. So we started looking, and this apartment had its own furnace, its own gas furnace. And it's, in most houses, your sheetrock in the walls is half-inch thick. And most adult males could easily stick a fist almost through it. But where you got the furnace, they use 3/4. And that's like hitting 2x4s. And we're shining a light up down the wall, and you can see the impression of shoulders and head, where he'd had the kid like this and slammed him into the wall above his head. And that to this day still bugs me.
I'd say I've covered crime far less than the other panelists on this panel, but I'd say the daily job definitely affects you if you're covering shootings or domestic violence on a daily basis. But at the same time, I think if we're in these positions to report on crime, it's exceptionally sad, but you sort of have to approach it, this is the work that we do, and, approach it in a very professional way so that it doesn't affect your mental health. But maybe Lance can talk a bit more. You've covered it for many more years than I have.
I agree with you. I think that it's important to keep up some distance. Yeah, so I've covered crime for about 20 years. I started out in Chicago, and there were exactly 666 murders the first year I worked, and I probably wrote about 300 of them, contributed to 300 of the stories. But in terms of the stories that stick out at you, I would say it's the ones that have no resolution, where the crime hasn't been solved and the person is still out there and you don't have answers. And, certainly a compelling example of that is the case we profiled for the latest season of the Gazette's true crime podcast, Colorado Cold Case. And that was longtime residents of the Springs probably remember, but it was a mother and her 2 children who were killed on Valentine's Day, 1985, and the mother and the young girl were sexually assaulted. It was a truly horrific crime. No one has ever been arrested. There were not similar crimes in Colorado Springs to tie it to. So it's one of these things that occurred where you don't know what happened, and it kind of haunts you. So.
I write because my best friend in grade school was a victim of a homicide when she was 21 years old. Her husband came home high on angel dust and killed her, and it struck me. We had gone our separate ways by that time, but I've always wanted justice. He was actually killed in the New Mexico prison riot, so it was a huge story. They left behind a 6-month baby girl who was raised by her grandparents. I love this family so much. The day that she died, I'd gone my separate ways from her, but I use her sister's name in my book. Her name is Melinda Archuleta, and I said, congratulations, you're going to be my ME in my book, so you're going to be a doctor. And she said, well, I'm already a doctor. I have a PhD. And what was really great is that 6-month-old baby grew up to be a social worker and has 4 kids of her own today. And so there is a happy ending, and that's why I write, to get justice for this, because we don't find it very often in our stories.
Thank you. So what aspect of your backgrounds has taught you or allowed you or inspired you to create in your medium? So like what inspired you to write or
I got started taping up these homicides because a friend, we had, there were 3 couples. We'd go to breakfast every Saturday. We'd known each other for years. And one lady said one day, her mother had a house on the west side of Colorado Springs, and it had been made into apartments, and she was going by one day, and there was a rental sign, so she just had to stop and see the place. So she goes in, she meets this lady that lives in an apartment above the front porch. It's a closed-in porch that had been open at one time. And the lady had a little 3-year-old girl. And the lady said she really liked the place else, except for one thing. Her little daughter was always having nightmares about the room covered with blood. So Lori asked me, says, can you find out if some major crimes happened there? I said, oh, it shouldn't be too hard. That was in 1997. So one of the 5 guys I went on the police department with back in 1968 was the head of the major crime unit. So I wanted to see him, and I said, can I get a list of your homicide index? He said, we don't have one. I said, you got to be kidding me. I mean, all the stuff I did back in the 70s, there's no list of any of that? And he said, no. So I went over to the library and talked to Ruth Davis, who I think came with the building, sweet lady. And she said, we get lots and lots of requests for this very type of information, but if it's indexed, we can look it up. If it's not, we have no way. So I said, well, let me see if I can't put an index together for you. Well, one thing led to another. Next thing you know, I'm typing up the newspaper articles. And 22 years later, here we are. It's fascinating to me. But it's led me into a lot of other things, too. In 1918, we had a homicide at Colorado and Nevada Avenues where a gang came to town, got in a shootout, and killed our chief of detectives. And when I started looking at that group, in 5 years, they killed 9 police officers between Missouri, Kansas, here, and California. And they actually got in a shootout. The last 2 members got in a shootout in Arcadia, California, which is just southeast of L.A. Well, I guess it's downtown L.A. these days. But 2 deputies got into it with them, and 1 deputy was killed, and that other deputy killed the 2 of them, and that was the end of the gang. I've been researching that gang now for 22 years, and I still haven't run out of stuff to find about them. It's amazing.
I'd say for the Colorado Cold Case podcast, what inspired us, I would say, was we pretty much reported on this podcast the way we would report on any other story, which if you take a listen to it, it sounds very different from other true crime podcasts. We used a lot of newspaper archives to get a lot of our information because this crime was so old. It happened 35 years ago. And a big part of my job is going to crime scenes or talking to people who have witnessed a crime or someone who have lost someone to gun violence. And so we did a lot of that, canvassing neighborhoods for this podcast. So it's definitely a lot of hard reporting for this podcast. And before I worked in Colorado Springs, I worked in New Orleans and was a crime reporter. So it was a very similar role in that, you're right outside the crime tape and talking to as many people as you can to try to get some more information, get a clear idea of what happened.
Yeah. I think when I started covering crime, I didn't quite understand. There was just sort of the excitement element of, rushing out to breaking news things, fires, shootings, that kind of thing. I was young, and it was just kind of fun, to indulge in the thrill of it. That wears off pretty quick. And what is left behind is just this sort of obligation to do your absolute best to figure out, who the victim was, right? What led them to that place that night, who the killer was, what led them to the place that night, and to try to give some kind of coherence to what happened. When somebody is killed in a town, certainly it's a disaster and a tragedy for the family involved, but it has an effect on all of us. It bothers all of us, and it raises questions for all of us. And our job is to just try to get the facts out there so that people can start to try to make sense of what happens and see if there are things that we might change and how we might prevent some of these things from happening again. And so that kind of puzzle is why I do it. It's what interests me in it.
You've heard that saying that when God closes a door, he opens a window. I was a certified shorthand reporter, and a hand injury knocked my career short. I had passed my written boards. My first case was a rape sodomy of a 6-year-old, And after that, I went to work for the other court reporters doing transcripts, because if they don't get their transcripts out, they can be held in contempt of court. Long story short, I was very, very busy, and I saw an ad for the Colorado Springs Business Journal, and I went to work for them and started writing spotlight articles and fell in love with writing. I was always a writer, but that was the great background with my court reporting. I had great English, I had great medical, I had great legal, and then I fell into reporting, or into non-editorializing, and then I had to learn fiction, which everything is, you editorialize in fiction. It's how you feel, is when if you're reading a story, it's how do you feel reading the story? Does it move you? Do you want to read further? So that's how I feel. I just fell into writing my stories, and I'm grateful.
So this has kind of been touched on for a few of you, but how do you conduct your research?
In my case, typing up the homicides, basically what I had to do was start reading the Gazette from its very beginning and read every newspaper. And it wasn't too bad when it was weekly. It went kind of quickly. But when we got up into the 1890s and they went to a daily, it kind of bogged things down. But I've still, to this day, will never run out of something to work on with that. That's the whole big thing with it. Also, I use Ancestry.com, Google on some occasions. You don't ever take them as gospel, but sometimes they're a good source for something to go look at. If you go single source, there's a guy that writes a lot of true crime books about criminals. His name is Nash, and he's got at least 3 or 4 big volumes out that are 1.5 to 2 inches thick. But he doesn't do a lot of research. He hits one thing and he just writes and sells. So that's the thing. If you want to do this, be sure and do more than one place at least to make sure that you're getting accurate information. And even when people think they've got accurate information, sometimes you find out years later it was all baloney.
I'd say our experience doing the podcast, it really felt like detective work, especially because this triple homicide happened so long ago. But we utilized, like I mentioned, newspaper archives to get a lot of our information. But we also went through the Ivywild neighborhood of where the crime occurred, and I think we talked to 2 people who had remembered what had happened, I believe.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked to a close friend of the girl who died, and we talked to a number of people who had some tie there, but we talked to 2 investigators who were involved in the investigation. One of the 2 detectives, Dick Reisler, the thing about these unsolved cases is that police are not excited to release new information. Just as a general rule, they see the release of new details as something that can damage their case. And so we are left to do our jobs largely without their input. In this case, we got really lucky because we got one of the 2 main detectives who was at least willing to speak with us about the broad contours of the case. We learned, more about the family dynamics of the mother and the 2 children. We learned about the psychological toll of investigating this crime for the police and other authorities involved. And we learned a really interesting detail that for several years after the killings, on the anniversary of the murders, Dick Reisler and his partner would sleep in the house. They would sleep in the house where the killings occurred on the off chance that someone would come back for whatever reason. It's just kind of a long shot that these guys did because they had exhausted every other avenue in their mind, and at this point they were throwing noodles at the refrigerator door. Finding information has changed a lot with the way technology has developed. When I started around 2001, everyone had landlines. And a big part of the race was figuring out what somebody's landline was. And To do that, we had reverse address directories, where if we figured out where you live, we could figure out what your phone number is, and that was an incredibly powerful tool. But that's all gone with the advent of cell phones. And what actually now is probably the most potent tool for journalists is social media. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, accounts where people go and share huge amounts of information about their lives. Surprisingly, in the crime beat, we get a lot of material out of social media. I think Olivia's covered more than one case where somebody has taken a photo of himself and that, leads somehow to the person's capture. But yeah, things are changing and we're having to change.
I think police get their most leads from Facebook because people are very proud of what they do, unbelievably. For me, I am an auditory learner. Obviously, I like to listen. I like to talk to people. And I like to pick up the phone and call people or visit them. One of my first brainstorms was visiting the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and I met with a lieutenant and a sergeant, and I had this great plot in mind. It was just the best plot ever. I was going to have my protagonist get a peach pit and get cyanide. It was just so intricate, just the best plot ever. And the lieutenant said, "Where does your plot take place?" And I said, "El Paso." And he says, "Well, why don't you just go across the border and get it in Mexico rather than go to all this intricate stuff?" And I thought, or we could do that. So the whole thing is talking to people and making these connections, because once you make these connections, I find that they're totally generous. I think that they love to help writers. I don't know if they love to reporters. It may be kind of different because they don't want to give away leads or important information that the killer might have. But for writers, they love pretend and they love to help, and that's been my experience. I've talked to coroners, I've talked to pharmacists. It's just been a really rewarding experience for me.
So let's talk about cold cases for a minute. What leads to a case being cold, and what does it take to reopen a cold case?
Well, in December of '76, there was a lady killed at the Antlers Hotel, Janet Conrad. She was an employee, and they found her back in the linen room where she'd been attacked, strangled with a vacuum cleaner cord, and sexually assaulted. And for years, and I do mean years, they talked to everybody ever been in the hotel, employees, past employees, every group that had ever had a meeting there, everything else, and just got nowhere. So now the way it was back in those days, after about a year, if you had no further leads or anything else, it kind of officially became a cold case. And it sat like that. They would look at them on occasion and see if something had come up. And in Jenna's case, 37 years later, in 2014, a guy was in prison in Canyon City, and there was a grant that had been put out. And so they were running the sexual assault cases that were unsolved in Colorado Springs through that, and his DNA turned up. And he was just a couple weeks from being released from Canyon City from another rape that he had been involved in and gotten locked up. And everybody was totally shocked about who this guy was, because it turned out when they went and talked to the family, he'd actually been a man that had dated some of the people in the family. But it wasn't a name that would have come up anywhere, and without the DNA, it would still be an open case. And what's funny is I don't think in '76 we knew what DNA even was, but we got some, and that's what matters, I guess.
I think Dwight would probably be the expert
you don't
on
have
that.
to have an answer.
Unless you want to add anything.
So this question is for Dwight. What is it like being known as the murder book guy? Have you met any individuals who have used it, and has anyone told you that it's helped them?
While I was working at this library one day, the guy that was head of special collections said that and a reporter talked to him after he'd spoken with me, and he says, "Is this guy kind of morose?" I laughed. I said, No. I don't mind being called the murder book guy. And have I met individuals that have used it? Actually, yes. It's not unusual for the library to call me and say somebody's looking for something more on a particular one and want to know if I'll speak to them, and I always do. And sometimes they can give me something that I didn't have, and I can go back and find more about what they're interested in. The library tells me it's one of the most used sets of things to reference that they have, that people come in and look it up all the time, because you can look it up by address, you can look it up by victim, by suspect, by date. So I'm tickled that people use it. That's what it's there for. And I'm approaching that time where somebody else is going to have to take this thing over with.
Let me just say that I'm a big fan. I've used some of that archival material. So it's been a
Thank you.
Yeah, actually on the killings of the 2 Coronado High School students in 2017, that's how I look at what I've written as I go on your summaries of everyone's stories, and yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the articles I typed up belong to these 2.
Amazing, cool. So, Olivia and Lance, I know you did 1 season of the podcast, correct? There are other seasons though, right?
I did 1, but Lance has done 2.
You've done more. Okay. So, have you, both of you, do you get approached by family members of victims? Like, have people ever asked you to cover their case?
I haven't, but maybe you can talk about that.
Yes. There are families who are very assertive about trying to get reporters to revive interest in their cases. That happens frequently. I would say that it's probably the exception. It's probably the minority of people. So many others who have lost a loved one just kind of withdraw and don't seek publicity. My experience, though, especially with unsolved killings, is that for the most part, anytime you call them looking for information or help, they'll provide it. It's not easy for them. It's not a pleasant task, but I think if you're someone who's lost a loved one and there's been no arrest, that feels like an obligation, that anytime you have a chance to make a difference, you try to make a difference. So yeah, we kind of see sort of the gamut of reactions from family members, but some of them do ask us to get this stuff in front of the public eye. In fact, and then sometimes we'll see a disagreement among different family members. So we were looking at profiling a different case.
May I have your attention, please? The library will close in 30 minutes. All library equipment that has been checked out.
I promise I'll wrap this up soon.
Again.
So one of the other ideas that we put some work into for a potential podcast was the murder of a man at the Citadel Mall. And we were interested in that because next to nothing about it is known, except that he had been involved in gangs. And we wanted to kind of tell the story for the first time who this guy was, because nobody got the story when he was killed. It just was one of those cases where we don't learn much about anyone involved, and the next murder comes and wipes it off the map. So anyway, we had hoped to revisit this one, tell people who he was, and also tell the story about the decline of the Citadel Mall, which is a really interesting story, because that in some ways is the story of the decline of the east side, of Colorado Springs. But we had disagreements among various family members about whether they wanted to cooperate with us. So I think that the guy's ex-wife was really interested, but the mother and the father were not, and it just didn't work out. A different season that I was not involved with, but that a different reporter worked on, she put a full month of research into a case when family members of the woman who disappeared decided they no longer wanted to work with us. So that's just something that happens. She ended up scrapping a month's worth of work. But that's just a different challenge that journalists have that other folks in this sphere don't, which is that we're dealing with real people and real stories, and we have to be very careful about them for that reason.
Thank you. Sorry. Donnell, when writing your books, how much have you had to tweak reality when taking inspiration from actual cases? For example, things like the CSI Effect, 24 hours, you have that DNA and it's all done.
The CSI Effect, how many of you are writers? I'm just curious. So if you are watching CSI and you're taking your writing from CSI, stop right now. Readers are very, very savvy, and they will nail you on anything that you get wrong. You'll hear about it. You did this. You did this. And CSI is entertainment. Readers they're very discerning. So with DNA, it thwarts a writer's. It's hard because it came out and it's great for proving guilt or innocence, but it's not the end all. If, for instance, I talked to a defense attorney one time that said that his client was acquitted because his DNA wasn't found at a crime scene. It just wasn't found. He was there, but he got off. So it's not the end all of. So you just have to be smarter, and your protagonist has to be as smart as your antagonist. So they watch CSI, they read books, they read newspapers, they see that they're supposed to shave their hair, they're supposed to wear gloves, they're not supposed to take a bite out of the apple in the refrigerator and leave their teeth marks or on the body or the apple. So you just have to really use a lot of red herring and misdirection. In this book, in Black Pearl, I have a serial killer who leaves a black pearl on the body. And the cold case is reunited when it heats up when a Denver new case is formed. I can't talk with this mask. When the body is found in a Denver crime scene and there's a pearl on it, it's 14 years later, and they think, oh my gosh, we've got a cold case. So during the medical examiner's investigation, they find semen on the body. And they think, okay, this is great, DNA, this is great. But they go back to the original cases, and the Black Pearl killer did not sexually assault his victims before killing them. So there's three things that could have happened. He changed his MO, or it was a copycat, or the victim had sex before she was abducted and killed. So it's a lot of fun doing misdirection because your readers like to solve a puzzle too. They want to, oh, this is what happened, so.
And we also touched a little bit on this already, but when working with the police departments that you've all worked with currently and in the past, how much can they tell you? Like, what kind of give and take can you get when asking certain questions?
For this particular podcast, we were unable to get any information from Colorado Springs Police, and we were told because it was an open investigation that, if they were to provide anything that could jeopardize the case. And the podcast that you worked on with Tim Watkins, did you have any participation from law enforcement?
No.
Okay, so it's...
But by and large, we get very little information from police about homicides and violent crimes. You guys are probably familiar with that just from reading the newspaper or seeing the news. You get a few sentences of information. And then when we end up fleshing out a story, it's usually from other resources. Say the woman had a restraining order. Well, we go out and pull the restraining order application, and suddenly now we know suddenly now we have a window into, domestic violence in the relationship, that kind of thing. We talk to family members, we attend court proceedings. There are lots of different avenues for us to get information apart from the police department. I will say that as a court reporter, there are definitely scenarios where I work with police sort of in an off-the-record capacity, like I'll attend an open court proceeding, and for some particular reason, they don't want a certain detail out. You know, we might talk about that, and I might find a different way to say something to kind of omit that detail for the purposes of their investigation without compromising, you know, the truth of my story. But apart from that, that's pretty much it. Otherwise, we are left to do our own detective work, so to speak, to learn about these things.
And just to add, a valuable source in this past podcast, and usually for most stories, was the coroner's office. And you can get a lot of information from an autopsy report. So.
Anyone else? Cool. So why do you think there is a true crime obsession? Like, I know it's been around for a while. It's everywhere now. What do you guys think?
I remember from when I was young, and Unsolved Mysteries was like a big phenomenon, and I thought it had peaked then, you know. So but what is turbocharging it now? Boy, I'm not sure. I think that people just love seeing mysteries solved. I think there's something really satisfying about that. Or, you know, in the obverse, you know, when a mystery isn't solved, there's something so galling about it that just keeps us coming back again and again, and we just keep working it out and trying to figure, has something been overlooked? Is there something that I can find that others didn't recognize? It seems to appeal to people with kind of a stubborn, even obsessive personality.
Great. And kind of going off of that, what do you all think about web sleuths? Good, bad? Do they do more harm than good? Do you have any experience working with any web sleuths? Are you a web sleuth?
True crime people have solved murders. I mean, I read a story about that recently, that a podcast solved a murder. As far as web sleuths go, again, there you see a gamut. You see like crazy sort of QAnon type stuff, where people are making connections that don't seem rational, that are more fanciful than anything. And then you've got people where it's like, you know, they're a short order cook, but they should have been a police detective or a journalist, because they're just that meticulous in their research, that driven, that savvy about where to go to find information. You know, I have come across web sleuths that stun me with the quality of their work. So, you know, I have come across web sleuths that you just think, boy, I hope I never run into that person in any way in my life. So yeah, it's an individual thing, I suppose.
No comment.
So just one more, and then we can go to questions if the audience has any. So in Joe Kenda's new book, he says, the most common triggers for homicide are fear, rage, revenge, money, lust, and more rarely, sheer madness. Do you agree? How do you feel about that statement, since you guys are so close to it?
He can tell a story. That's enough said.
That's a tough question. I'm going to have someone else answer first.
Well, yeah. Did you write our homicide wrap-up? Did you? I don't know how to respond to what Kenda said, but you know, domestic violence is you know, a leading factor in killings here.
Right.
I would say that killings involving service members have been a persistent concern for years and years, especially since the onset of the wars, and the kind of problems that we're seeing with PTSD and TBI. It's something that has gotten a lot of attention. That is, you know, Fort Carson's role in murders. It's gotten a lot of attention maybe 10 years ago, but not much lately. But it's domestic violence and Fort Carson are two really big factors. And gangs, I don't know. What else, Dwight? What are some other?
I think you've covered, that's true. I think a lot of it is domestic violence. And a lot of what you see on TV is the domestic violence in these shows. And I think they're just trying to show what they think is really going on, and there's a lot to that. Now, one of my favorite shows was CSI Las Vegas. You know, here's this town with all this gambling, but apparently they have no money. because they have the people working the crime lab and one detective. And I kind of feel sorry for that guy because the crime lab has to go out and arrest everybody. You know, I work in the crime lab. Thank goodness I didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I think that maybe drug abuse might also be a contributing factor. And I, as somebody who writes psychology and psychological thrillers, I definitely agree with him about mental illness is a very high rate of murder. Domestic violence is definitely up there. Money, greed. When I was a volunteer victims advocate, we had, I'm not going to go there, I shouldn't do that. So I would say, and I just have to say about Joe Kenda, I just love his quote, "If you murder, I will find you." So.
Do we have any audience questions? Yeah. Let me see if I make a loud squeak or something.
First of all, thank you. Very interesting. And I was thinking about, I think her name is Michelle McNamara, the East Bay rapist. There was a series on about her investigation to solve the murder. Anyway, my question is, do you enjoy in your spare time, do you like to watch true crime documentaries or programs, or do you just really want nothing to do with that?
Is the Pope Catholic?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Which? Absolutely which?
To watch the
You watch them?
Yeah, the crime shows.
Oh.
One of our favorite shows, my husband and I, we love New Tricks by the BBC. Has anybody seen it? It's there. During COVID, we had to watch all these things, and it's a woman who has been demoted because she shot a dog, and she's working with 4 old timers, and they're bringing cold cases back, and so it's really, really fascinating. So it's right up my alley.
I personally can't take procedurals just because I sit in a courtroom for sometimes 8 hours a day, and I cannot take them laying out step by step what they did and what comes next, because it's the same approach every single time. You know? So I like True Detective on HBO. I don't know if you saw that. I like The Wire. I liked Homicide, Life on the Streets, which was early 90s. You know, those, I like ones that sort of respect the reality of you know, the murder business, so to speak, rather than, you know, sort of dress it up and make it fanciful like CSI. So that's my personal preference. But no, I don't generally avoid crime since it's what I do.
I am slightly addicted to Netflix documentaries. I think they do, some of them I think are really great. Like Lance said, there's a better production, I feel like, than some other, maybe CSI or some other crime shows. But I do recognize that I could be covering some very depressing content for 8 hours a day, and then I go to Netflix and watch, you know, about someone being killed. So I understand that that's not always healthy, so I try to be aware of that.
So one comment, when you were talking about the Peach Pit, I immediately thought of Palisades. But what is kind of the most complicated case or surprising case that you learned about? That just had a twist that you weren't expecting.
Boy, that's a stumper.
I don't know about a case with a surprise twist, but the most complicated thing that I covered in terms of crimes was a series of shootings committed by a guy named Bruce Nazzolino. I don't know if anyone's heard that name, but it was a really big deal in law enforcement circles because he targeted a couple judges He shot into the house of a judge. Narrowly missed him. Bullet flew right past his head. That's William Martinez. He retired a couple years ago. He shot into a defense attorney's house and missed him, and then shot at the defense attorney while he was working in his office and shot his eye out.
John Ciccalella.
Yeah, John Ciccalella. And then that was in 2001, 2002. And something like 8-9 years later, there was a murder that went unsolved, and police eventually figured out that it was a guy who was having an affair with Nozzolino's wife more than a decade earlier. So Nozzolino was like one of the famous crime suspects in town because everyone knew that police thought he was good for all these shootings. But they just didn't have the evidence to arrest him. And unlike a lot of people, he did not lie low. He was very active in Rocky Mountain Gun, whatever that gun group is. He was active with Douglas Bruce in various anti-tax measures. He was just sort of a gadfly about town who would constantly talk about the fact that police thought he was a murderer, you know, who had terrorized a judge. And this went on for like 10 years, and he would taunt the police. You know, the same two cops were the lead on this thing for like more than a decade, and he would taunt them when he would see them out. It's just kind of a bizarre case. But it culminated with his arrest in 2001 after a grand jury indictment, and then I ended up covering his trial for, I think it was 2 months, and I did stories every single day except for one day of trial, just because there were so many moving parts. Part of the reason why he was so hard to catch is that he was also a competitive shooter, and he would constantly buy and trade guns, and he would buy and trade barrels of guns. So he would put guns together, take them apart, sell the barrel to this guy, sell the stock to that guy, get this one back. You know, he had an ammunition making room inside his apartment. So there was gunpowder on everything. He kept a shooting bag inside his car, so there was gunpowder in his car. All the things that cops normally look for, you know, were not diagnostic for him because his whole life was guns and ammunition and shooting. So anyway, that was probably one of the most complicated cases that I've covered. By the way, he was convicted of the 3 shootings, and he's doing life plus like 156, and they didn't have a shred of physical evidence on him, none. It was 100% circumstantial case, fascinating case.
In the late 70s, we had 2 guys that were GIs that were actually serial killers, and it took a long time to put together that these victims were all from the same guy. In fact, I can't remember his name, a fellow that played psychiatrist on Cheers.
Kelsey Grammer. Kelsey
Grammer. His sister was here in town, and she was one of them that was a victim of this group. And it took a long time to put together who these people were and how they were involved. In fact, there was another homicide, and it occurred out at Fort Carson that the FBI investigated, and it was like several years before they realized these guys were also involved in his killing. So sometimes those can just get totally out of hand, and trying to put all this stuff together, and you often wonder, do you get everybody? And I know that our guys went down to Florida to interview some serial killers that had been here doing things, and they'll tell you stories all day long, and they're hard to interview, and most of them are extremely intelligent. From my point of view, they're just nuts. I guess that's not scientific, but anyway, that's kind of the way I look at these guys.
I have a question for the podcast. May I ask it? Do you remember the woman who was in the school parking lot by Rock Grimmen? And it was a death case penalty. Do you remember that? Am I making this?
Is that the school teacher that was in the van?
Yes, yes. What happened? I mean, they were sent. It was a death penalty case, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. But I don't remember the last time they've ever done a death penalty in Colorado.
Right. So it's not a cold case, so you wouldn't be interested in it, but I just always thought that was such a
Which-
fascinating case.
I'm not familiar.
No, I don't know which case.
And then, well, I can't think of her name, it's been too many years. Does anyone know?
Did she just disappear and it's a
No,
missing
she
woman?
was,
Oh.
they found her body the next morning. So, we've had some fascinating cases in Colorado Springs.
Jasinski?
I'm sorry?
Jasinski, something close to that.
Jelinsky? Yeah, I know, yeah.
It was horrific, so that's why I thought, I wondered about that.
I think we have time for one final one.
I wondered about the woman that's on TV, and I can't think of her name either, but she's doing DNA genetics. She had her own series for a short time.
I can't hear.
She's asking about a woman who's on TV who has a show about DNA genetics.
I don't.
Solving
I'm not-
crimes by the genetics
Yeah.
of a DNA find. She's now working for 60 Minutes in 2020, I think. She's totally self-taught. She's the only one doing it that I'm aware of. I wondered what you thought of that. She's tracked down killers by going through their family line.
If you have
Yeah,
any thoughts on solving cases by going
Well,
through the
genetic-
family line.
She was a cocktail waitress earlier in life, and she's
Well, I know law
developed this whole
enforcement
field
agencies
by
are using
herself.
things like social stuff like Ancestry and things like that, where there's stuff that's posted on DNA, and they're getting familial stuff because there's so much out there now. So like I could be related 4 times over from somebody, and they come up and they go, hey, your DNA is here, and it matches somewhat. So somebody in your family, so that's giving them a place to go look. So yeah, there's all this stuff's coming up. In fact, well, the early DNA didn't tell you a whole lot, but it has jumped so far forward, and everything they can tell now is just absolutely amazing. And from very little bits that 20 years ago would have meant nothing, and now it's the front leading edge in probably almost everything.
I wondered why our show went away, because it was totally fascinating.
That's how they solved the East Bay rapist case, was through genetic genealogy, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Do you have any closing comments or statements?
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks
Well,
for
thank
your
you.
interest.